Hi.
Hello.
Oh, hi. Hi again.
Okay. Good afternoon. It is great to see so many on this call on the Scholar panel discussion on communication. My name is Simone Kölz, and I am the Assistant Director for International Scholar Services at SISS, a unit of Global Affairs. And on behalf of SISS, Services for International Students and Scholars, I'd like to welcome you all. And I also would like to thank Drs. Wang, Zhang, and Wojciech for taking the time to prepare and share information about the very interesting research on this very timely topic. I think we've all experienced changes in communication and how we see communication and how we had to adapt to different communication modes during the last couple of months. So this promises to be a very engaging and exciting forum. Throughout the years, UC Davis has hosted thousands of international scholars from over 100 countries who made significant contributions related to research, teaching, and outreach while at our institution. So currently we are ranking 10th nationwide in hosting international scholars. And just to provide a little bit more information about our scholar population, it is very diverse in regards to research fields and also the time spent here, ranging from a couple of months to years. So our scholars are either visiting or they are employed as postdocs, researchers, faculty, or staff. Again, I want to thank our three panelists for taking the time to impart information about their fascinating research. I know I'm very much looking forward to hear more. So now I'm handing it over to Rob Davis, our Director of Intercultural Programs at Global Affairs, who will be facilitating the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. And again, my welcome to all of you, and thanks for coming. Our topic today is communication with impact, and we're really excited to have three panelists who will present their research and learnings. We'll interact with each other a bit over what they've heard from the others, and then we'll have some time to take questions from you. So that's the way it's going to be structured. About each of them will have about 15 minutes to present their research on the broad theme of communication and get into the specifics of how they're approaching it on very timely, I would say, topics. I will then ask them to reflect on some of the things they've heard from the other panelists for a few moments. And then for about the last 20 to 25 minutes, we'd be happy to take your questions. And the way we'd like to do that is for you to use the chat function at that time. And we'll take as many questions as we can. And that will be our day. So our three panelists today, and I'll say a little bit more about each of them, are Dr. Haochuan Wang, who's an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science, Dr. Jingwen Zhang, assistant professor in the Department of Communication, and then Dr. Magdalena Wojciech, who is a professor also in the Department of Communication. So Dr. Wang, if you would go ahead and start your presentation. I'll just give a brief introduction. So as I said, Dr. Wang is an associate professor in computer science. He was an associate professor at the National Tsinghua University in Taiwan, also in computer science. He's interested in understanding and supporting social interactions in various theoretical and application contexts. His work has contributed to the design of interactive, I'm sorry, I probably need to stop sharing so you can share. Let me say it again. His work has contributed to the design of interactive and collaborative tools for team diversity, multilingual conversation, nonverbal communication, and group creativity. He also looks into how computer-mediated communication tools can be shaped to address societal issues such as bridging cultural and language gaps between global co-workers, support expert novice knowledge transfer, which I find fascinating, to ensure sustainable work practices in digitally mediated gig economies. Dr. Wang, we're really excited to have you with us, and I'd ask you to go ahead and share some of your background.
Yes, thank you, Rob, for the very nice introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Haochen Wang from Department of Computer Science. Today, I'm excited to be here with the International Education Week to talk about my work, especially in this exciting panel about communication with impact. Okay, so my title is Design for Mediated Communication. I'm a human-computer interaction researcher, and this is broadly as a field, okay, that we look at various things that concern with how people use digital technologies, and by using that understanding to support the design and the construction of this computing system to better the interactions machine and the human can have. Okay, so Rob already kind of introduced me, so I'll be very brief with this slide. As Rob said, I spent in the past 10 years, I spent a majority of my time in Asia, where I was started as an assistant professor and continued as an associate professor until 2018. And my focus at that time, I teach in Asia. My focus was a lot with like promotion and education and fostering some kind of a kind of international perspectives. In my community of HCI, to consider how do we better global collaboration? Okay, so that was my focus, for a very long time, and I've been moving to UC Davis for about 3 years so far. I continue to focus, my work on collaborative and social technology. But this day, I start to think about, expert novice knowledge transfer. How would you? This is about how do we teach and spread the knowledge, in a distributed manner, and also how do we facilitate the changing landscape and changing scenario these days, when the work become quite flexible and people have a bit more freedom like gig work, but at the same time there be maybe less control and less protection for workers, and how do we deal with that from the perspective of social technologies? Okay, so yeah, in my community, which is HCI, which is a sub-community under computer science, okay, and my specific focus is on collaborative and social technology. And our committee, the name of the committee is actually Computer Supported Collaborative Work. So we call this CSCW, because early days, our focus is indeed on work productivity. But these days, we have broadened a lot with our focus. And I'm going to chair this conference on 2022. Hopefully, it's an in-person conference. Hopefully, no longer virtual. Okay, and it will be in Taipei. And for that, we are actually organizing a series of events, educational events, to promote this knowledge and this kind of a research topics in the Asia Pacific region. And we already have 2 workshops, one in Kyoto last year, and another one is coming out in Taipei this year. Okay. So now back to my research. Okay. So my interest is on studying, the impact of technologies. And when we talk about mediated interactions or mediated communication, more specifically, the technology we are talking about is essentially the channel that people use to exchange message. Okay, so I'm just drawing the insights from communication scholars and also from communication engineers, and they often use, this is a very simple model, and it's probably oversimplified, a very simple model to conceptualize the relation between human and technologies. Okay, so as human, we generate, okay, we send and we receive, we understand the messages. Okay, and so the agent here refer to human. Okay, so that's a more traditional model. We think that the agents are human. Okay, and then we will pass the signals, right? These messages, through some channels. So you need some channels, of course. I mean, we can talk face to face, but face to face is, you can think this as a channel, and then we will pass the signals. And when you pass the signals, it may come with noises. Okay. And but if you can find a way to separate the signal and noises, then you can do mediated communication at a distance. Okay, so a lot of work, say in computer engineering, was about how to represent the message. Okay, and how to improve the signal to signal to noise ratio. Okay, so that, and even with like low power, kind of low demanding kind of network, you still can remotely. Okay, so coming back to communication efficacy, right? If we care about, say, the communication is about that people can understand the message, people can get a message with clarity, so there's assumptions. It's like, the more signals the channel can pass, right, the better will be the quality of the communication will be. Okay, so for example, given an example like face-to-face, right, because you can talk, you can use your face, you can make gestures, right? So this is a very traditionally very ideal scenario that face-to-face will be sort of the gold standard, okay, where you can pass the most signals that people can generate, okay, and communication is likely to be the best, okay. So that's the assumption that we have. So one natural question is, when it comes to the time of media communications, right? Because just like right now, all the communication is mediated, right? All the interaction is mediated, right? It's just very natural that we will just ask the questions, right? Does this kind of media modality, right, say face-to-face video, audio test, right, does that affect the way we interact, right? Does it affect the process and affect the outcomes, right? And there have been numerous work looking into this kind of media comparison issues. And with my student, we also did a little bit study with this, and this was a work that we did back in 2014, where we try to use kind of commodity motion sensor. Here we use Microsoft Kinect, okay, which is like a game controller, but because it can capture kind of a human body motions, so we just use that as a sensor of a nonverbal gesture, nonverbal behaviors during communication. So you probably can see a picture here. My student sitting, in the lab, we put a kind of video in the middle to simulate video communication, okay, just like video conferencing, okay. And then we use Kinect to capture, the motion controller to capture their hand movement while they're talking. And we study those signals to see what people are doing when they can talk to each other in face-to-face versus video versus audio, okay. So remember the ideal conceptual model about communication I just showed you, right? If face-to-face is the best, right, we should see some kind of universal effects where the more signal people pass, then the better communication outcome is there. Okay, that's an ideal situation, right? But it turns out that in our study and also in other people's study, we have started to see that modality actually doesn't have this kind of constant effect. Isn't that ideal? Okay, and I was told not to be technical, but I think this chart is interesting, and it's actually not that complex. I had to take a little bit time just to explain what this is about. Okay, this chart shows the relations between people's understanding, which is a communication outcome. Okay, people's understanding of the message in this kind of two-person conversation, and the amount of gesture they use, okay, individually use during that conversation. So it's a relation between the two. So you can see basically there's a positive correlation. The more gesture people use, the better understanding they have. Okay, there's an interesting kind of a lengthy discussion of this, because the relation is not about like my partner's gesture is improving my understanding. The relation is actually about my self gesture improving my understanding. It's correlational, but there's a relation. Okay. And there's a theory supporting that it's actually more about self-use of the gesture, but not about partner use of the gesture. But it's too lengthy, so let's don't go there. But what's interesting is that we don't see a constant effect of the modality. You can see that when people don't use that much gesture, okay, so on the left of the chart, you can see that, yes, you see a media effect, right? You can see a modality effect. Face-to-face is better than video, and video is better than audio. People understand the best when they use face-to-face, okay? But there's only a case that when there's not much gesture. When people start to use more and more gesture, you see the difference between the modality just disappear, okay? And so this is just interesting. Of course, it has implication at a very high level. Is like, people probably can change the constraints, right? We can overcome the constraint that the media is imposing on us, okay? The modality seems to be so difficult, especially right now. We are teaching online, we are doing the work online. It seems to be so difficult. But by seeing this chart, it gives us some hope that there might be a way to overcome that. Okay, so the key is like, is there a way, just in the context of this study, right? The key is that maybe if there's a way that we can help people to improve their gesture use, and then that's what we call interaction design. Okay, it's like you design interactive feature to foster certain behavior to happen, certain interactive behavior to happen. Okay, if there's a way to do that, right, to foster people's gesture use, then even with maybe a less ideal medium, right, like audio, okay, it's not as rich as face-to-face, but you probably can still reach the level of interaction outcome that you want, just like face-to-face. Okay, so you can see that I see this as a chart to show that interaction design does matter in this kind of situation in mediated communication. So we need to design for mediated interaction. Okay. So I want to give you just one example to demonstrate that how this kind of design can work. Okay. And here let's switch the context to multilingual communication, which I think is quite relevant to this panel as well. It's like when you have a team, but your team member come from different language communities, they don't share the same native language. So they pick one common language to communicate. Very commonly, this will be English, but this can also be other languages. And so how would you make sure that everyone in the meeting understand the things that we are talking about? So people have the same page, they are on the same page, they are on the same ground, okay? This is work I collaborate with my former students and also my collaborators in Japan, okay? So a very intuitive solution that people may come out is to let's introduce some computational support, because human has the least kind of limitation, right? With understanding a different language, right? Because of language proficiency issue. So let's use machine to augment that. This is a very natural idea. So let's use computational support to augment that, such as machine translation. So you can speak and you can understand message in your own language, right? So you don't necessarily need to know the other language that much. And the other tool that we found useful is to use speech recognition to generate automated transcript, just like what you see on the picture here. It's a video, but you see the caption, right? So this is so common these days. And this kind of automated transcription does help, okay, non-native speakers, because this kind of modality, right? They can read, that sort of provide extra cognitive resources, give them a little bit more time to process the message, and with some design, maybe they can actually go back to review the previous sentences, previous messages. Okay, so that does help. From empirical study, we know that does help. Okay, but the problem is that if we just use this in a very straightforward manner, just throw the automated transcription to people, and then you put that into the team where a native speaker and a native speaker are interacting, this may end up with the case that here's just a diagram showing that what we are seeing. Okay, is the workload. Okay. The workload are not balanced, right? Native speaker doesn't have to do anything in the meeting and they can understand well. But for non-native speaker, they are already speaking a non-native language. The transcription may help, but the transcription can come with error, okay? These are computational support. It may come with error. It doesn't understand the context, right? There are numerous things and they have to process that. So there are extra burden the non-native speaker are facing. So we may not be able to fully materialize, right, the benefit of transcription. Okay. So
Dr. Wang, about 3 minutes, please.
Yes. Okay. So if we introduce interaction design, so what we will be seeing is that you think about what kind of behaviors the native speaker can do, right, and you provide the interactive feature. So like here, what we do is that we ask them to do highlighting. Okay, we ask them to highlight what's important, in that transcript. Okay, for the non-native speaker, so we design an interface for enabling that. Okay, so in this way, you are asking them to rebalance, right, the workload. Okay, and then help out the non-native speaker. Okay, so the result is just straightforward as we expected. We rebalance the workload. We no longer see the disparity, between the workload between native and non-native speaker when we introduce this kind of interactive feature. Okay, and it's just much more comfortable for non-native speaker in that meeting, and they think the message is much more clear. Okay, just just a case study. Okay, but I just want to show you that this kind of interaction design can kick in to help out. And currently, with my collaborators and with my students, we are borrowing this kind of paradigm to look at mediating knowledge transfer issue when expert and novice, the distribution of them they are not necessarily collocated in the same place. Okay, so experts can be remote, right? And also there are fewer experts than novice in some communities, right? And how would you make sure the knowledge people need can be accessed and can be shared, right? So we are also thinking about interaction design approach to address this issue. And with my current student at UC Davis, we are looking at the mediated sense making, and I think this is something that the later, the panelists, Dr. Zhang will be talking about, like misinformation, how people make sense of that, and can we leverage other people's expertise to support, someone who has less expertise with dealing with this kind of information to better make sense of potential misinformation, like online videos, right, that hasn't been verified. Okay, but this is something we are still working on, and I'd like to be share this kind of a result in the future. Okay, just to conclude, I think the message I want to share with everyone today is I understand now it's a difficult time, right? But think about the tools we are using. It's definitely, I believe it's not as good as face-to-face. I always miss the time that we have with in-person meetings, right? In-person conferences. Everyone is like sharing the similar feeling, right? But with interaction design, maybe we can figure out. I think this is what we are going to do. For the long term, is some kind of solutions, right? Some kind of design process to help us, find a solution, find the technology, contextualize in the setting, in the work that we are doing. Okay, and that's going to help everyone. Okay, with participating and with interaction for the long term. Okay, thank you. That's my presentation. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. Appreciate it. And if you could stop screen sharing, and we'll go to Dr. Zhang now, who can screen share.
Okay.
Dr. Zhang, thank you, Dr. Wang, and we'll come back and you'll have an opportunity to reflect on what some of the others are saying.
Okay,
Dr. Zhang is an assistant professor, as I said, in the Department of Communication and a faculty member of the Department of Public Health Sciences. She takes a social scientific approach to study online health information, new media and technology-assisted health interventions, and persuasive messaging strategies for health behavior changes. She directs the Communication and Health and Technology Lab at UC Davis, where her recent research investigates impacts of vaccine misinformation and potential correction strategies in changing vaccination attitudes. On COVID-19, she has published research showing the association between online disclosures of symptoms and reported infection cases in the circulation of COVID conspiracy theories on Chinese social media. Dr. Zhang, we're looking forward to seeing what you have to say today.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob, for the very well formulated introduction. And I was very excited to learn new research coming from Dr. Wang's lab. So now I think you're seeing my lab's website. So that's where I'm going to start introducing my research and the different projects that I'm currently working on. So just to give you a heads up, I don't have many slides as Dr. Wang prepared. I only had 5 slides, but I hope that I can deliver a very clear story to you about my research on the very specific topic of vaccine misinformation. Okay, so just want to introduce you to my lab's website, where if you have time, you can go to the URL chatterlab.ucdavis.edu. I'm currently an assistant professor in Department of Communication, and I'm also a faculty affiliated with the Department of Public Health Sciences. So my work touches on the 2 fields. One is health communication, the other one is going into very practical directions with public health interventions and evaluations. So on the website, you will see several of my research topics, including persuasive technology and health interventions. So in this area, I'm actually developing new type of technology-assisted technological interfaces, like using artificial intelligence chatbots for delivering health information to change people's beliefs, attitudes, and also behaviors in the health domain. And at the same time, I'm also doing some work with my graduate students on designing online social network interventions for changing people's behaviors. And I will introduce some of the background knowledge on that. And the other major agenda of my research involves about understanding how people communicate health information, symptoms using social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and also trying to investigate how those type of sharing of information on social media actually influence people's beliefs towards certain behaviors like vaccination, and how those type of beliefs translate into actual behaviors of getting vaccines in time. So that's the broader agenda of my research. And in case that I don't have enough time towards the end, I just want to thank my graduate students, the team who are really devoting a lot of time in collecting data from social media and also doing a lot of analysis on large scale of understanding how people share health information on social media and developing specific technologies for helping individuals to adopt healthy behaviors to promote better health outcomes as a society. Yeah, so my lab is very international. So currently I have students who are in China, who are in India, who are in South Korea. So we have to actually organize a time that works for everyone. So I think that's very related to what Dr. Wang is trying to develop as a collaborative framework or technological platform for everyone who are actually in very different time locations and physical locations to work together and to realize research ideas into actual products with impact on individuals and society. Okay, so now I'm switching to my actual slides with the very specific topic on vaccine misinformation on social media. I chose this very specific domain to introduce several studies because I think it's maybe I just guess many people will have interest in learning about what's our knowledge about understanding vaccine misinformation circulated on social media, and also what are the impacts of those vaccine misinformation on individuals' understanding of a vaccination issue, and what to do about it. So, so this is the topic. So the first thing I want to introduce to the audience is the term called misinfodemics. So this term, as you can tell, it's really a combination of misinformation and epidemic. So when we talk about misinfodemic, it refers to the spread of a particular health outcome or disease facilitated by the spread of misinformation. So this phenomenon is relatively new because it's really facilitated by the capacity of social media to widely spread misinformation or disinformation in people's online social networks. As we understand the spread of this misinformation in online social networks, one assumption is that when people are exposed to this type of misinformation, they're going to change their understanding and beliefs toward certain things like vaccination, therefore changing their behaviors of delaying vaccination or abandoning vaccination at all. So if that happened, what we would expect is that diseases that were previously prevented by vaccines will come back again, right? So that we saw some of the news from 2019 showing that the measles outbreaks in New York State, and some of those long time eradicated diseases may come back because of people's decision as a society to not vaccinate their children or themselves, right? So that's the idea of misinformation circulated on social media may facilitate the spread and diffusion of diseases that could be prevented by vaccines. And there are a lot of research going on in this field, and it's really about a complex sense of understanding the interaction between information diffusion on the online world and also behavior diffusion in the offline world. Misinformation can easily spread through online social networks, and that claim has been documented in a lot of empirical research. So for example, this is what we could kind of like hypothetically understand how information and behavior spread. So on one hand, if you have ever saw one information on Facebook or Twitter, you can just simply click on share and that information gets out. So that sharing behavior is relatively easy. And a lot of vaccine misinformation is highly emotionally arousing. So as you can see in this picture, some of the examples coming from Instagram. So you see baby crying and a lot of hyperbole languages used in the extraction of exaggeration of vaccine harms or safety issues. So those type of informations is very easily to arouse, for example, emotions of anger or anxiety, right? So those type of highly arousing information could facilitate the information to be spread faster and also wider in online social networks. So let's see if the misinformation gets spreaded a lot on social media. What would happen next is that people's psychology, cognition, emotions will be influenced by those information. Then the anti-vaccine beliefs will be developed based on exposure to this type of misinformation. But anti-vaccine beliefs or specific behaviors and social norms, they spread in a kind of a different dynamic here. So those anti-vaccine beliefs, they spread more likely to be within clustered online social networks composed of overlapping network peers, which means that we could imagine the information gets farther out on the social media networks, but we're more likely to observe local clusters of individuals who share very strong anti-vaccine beliefs together. So those, like this part of the network would refer to the specific dedicated anti-vaxxer group you could imagine that are very active on social media. So this type of dynamics of information exposure and belief diffusion create a phenomenon that is studied in sociology called majority illusion, which means that if you're a person who's taking a position in this particular spot in that local network, you actually perceive all of your friends, all of your peers are sharing the same ideas with you, like, oh, we're all like anti-vaccine. And then so psychologically, you would develop a majority illusion thinking that the world of the internet or my local community all share my own personal beliefs in anti-vaccination ideology. So this is problematic, right? Because for this individual, it's really losing the bigger picture of what the majority of the population are thinking about. And it's the case that actually majority of the information existing on social media and online still is normal and pro-vaccination, right? So it's just for this pockets of the networks that we're seeing that aggregations of a lot of misinformation in vaccination beliefs. So my research then asks a series of questions within this bigger picture. So the first question that I'm currently studying is, let's see, so the previous slide gives you some background knowledge about what is actually happening on social media and also with regard to vaccination. So the actual question for a research is, what is the actual prevalence of misinformation? So we have to have some ground data to actually understand what's the actual prevalence of that. So one project my PhD student and I are currently working on is trying to just pin down that specific number to show what is the actual prevalence of vaccine misinformation. We gathered a sample of almost 500,000 Instagram posts related to vaccines. Back in the last two years, we used a bunch of keywords related to vaccines and specific vaccines to gather that initial data set. So from there, so the task now becomes, how do we actually label or classify each of the posts into the different categories that we conceptualize as anti-vaccine and also misinformation. So here, these are two different concepts. Anti-vaccine basically means that you share an attitude towards not believing in vaccine science or just disliking vaccine in total. So it could be very subjective attitude. Versus misinformation is kind of like grounded more on the objective side of classification, which means that the specific post would deliver information that is against the current scientific understanding of vaccines. So it's possible that an anti-vaccine post doesn't contain misinformation because it's only like a personal expression. So we want to actually separate out these two things and then to understand what is prevalence of both. So far, the approach we're taking is to use a cross-authing approach. So this is a website we developed for individuals to go and annotate the post that we selected from Instagram. So as you can see here, the participants are given specific instructions of looking at the post and then give their choices. Very simple. So this one asks, what is the attitude of the post? And the person said anti-vaccine, pro-vaccine, neutral. And the other question is, does the displayed post contain misinformation? Yes, no, not sure. And then with the caption of this picture. So this is one example. And as a potential user, you could say it's a pro-vaccine and does not contain misinformation. So again, as you see here, it's kind of like subjective, because when you're actually looking at this post, you also bring your own existing biases, right? So let's say if I'm more like a pro-vaccine person, I'm more likely to actually see pro-vaccine posts, and also more likely to just pick out misinformation versus someone else who's like a conspiracist and then believe in those conspiracy theories about vaccines. For that person, he or she is more likely to not annotate that post as containing misinformation, because the misinformation is actually the truth in their minds, right? So we want to actually try to develop a very rigorous way to address this problem. So in this particular ongoing project, we're recruiting about 40 MTurk annotators who are the online workers who are working on content annotations. And then we ask them to fill out a pre-survey of their existing attitudes toward vaccines, and then they go to this website to annotate. So currently we're analyzing the results, and we already find some signals showing that people's existing biases do actually bias the way that they look at specific posts, and we want to balance out those individual posts with their existing biases to understand the true prevalence of anti-vaccine posts and misinformation. And after that, we're using natural language machine learning approaches to develop an automatic algorithm to actually perform that task for this whole data set. So far, my student has worked out the algorithm, and the result here is
Dr. Zhang,
yeah.
about 2.5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be able to finish. So here we, so within this Instagram data set, we have labeled 28% of the Instagram posts as delivering an anti-vaccine attitude. And we haven't finished with the misinformation classifiers that will be coming up. But just looking at this 28% of the posts existing on Instagram, I would say it's a significant amount of anti-vaccine posts actually living on Instagram. So it's important, right? So we did some work like 2 years ago, and I think the prevalence has increased over this 2 years window from 2018 to 2020 today. So so this prevalence will fluctuate, and because of the Instagram or Twitter are actually doing their own content moderation processes, but this is the one number that we got from our own research. The other question is about what is the impact of misinformation, right? So first, I understand the prevalence, and next question is what is the actual impact on people of being exposed? So this is a paper my other student and I published this year. In this paper, we basically pinned down that the misinformation's negative impact on people's pro-vaccination attitude is mostly mediated through the emotion of anger. So not so much about like a one-time exposure would change your beliefs or understanding of vaccine, but rather those misinformation will arouse people to feel really angry. And that anger emotion would actually make people more likely to say no to vaccines and to have a very negative association with vaccines in general. So we think that emotional component is very important to understand how misinformation influences people. Lastly, the question is what to do about this misinformation. So currently we're doing a lot of work on trying different type of fact-checking labels or correction strategies to see if those labels would be effective in reversing or mitigating the effect of misinformation. So in this study, we basically presented people with a misinformation post and then conjuncted with a fact-checking label and testing different sources like from this artificial algorithm or from this FDA. So different sources would have different implications for the correction effects. So this is one result I want to highlight, which is really showing that we did find effect of fact-checking labels effects on improving people's pro-vaccine attitude after being exposed to this particular post. So that basically means that we now have some evidence showing that by fact checking, giving this misinformation a label, it could mitigate some of the negative impact of misinformation on people's vaccination attitude. So we have presented this result at a conference, and this paper is currently under review. So I really hope to see it coming out soon. So that will actually lay some evidence for platforms to think about doing more rigorous type of content moderation and also labeling procedures on their platform to reduce this problem of a misinfodemic. And especially in this current situation with the COVID vaccine coming to the place very soon, like we heard about the positive news, right? So I really hope this would be contribute a lot to practices that we are doing in understanding misinformation and also the content moderation on social media. Magdalena will give you more exciting research in this domain as well. So I will stop here. Okay. Thank you. Rob, you're muted.
Still muted.
I apologize. My computer froze on me for a moment. I'm very sorry about that. Thank you, Dr. Zhang, and thank you for everybody's patience while I was trying to rectify the problem with my computer. If you would, yeah, so thank you. And we're going to go on to our final presenter, Dr. Magdalena Wojciechak, who we've already said is a professor of communication here at UC Davis. She's also an associate researcher at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research at the University of Amsterdam, where she directs the ERC starting grant titled Citizens Exposed to Dissimilar Views in the Media, Investigating Backfire Effects. Dr. Wojciechak is part of the Misinformation Committee at the Social Science One, first ever partnership between academic researchers and social media platforms, and of an independent research partnership between researchers and Facebook to study the impact of Facebook and Instagram on key political attitudes and behaviors during the US 2020 election. Wouldn't say that's very relevant to us right now, but I think it is actually. Her research focuses on how people select political information in the current media environment and on the effects of these selections on attitudes, cognitions, and behaviors. She also examines the effects of mass media, new information technologies, and various message types on tolerance, perceptions, and polarization as related to intergroup relations. All very timely, much like the other two presentations. Dr. Wojciechak, why don't you go ahead and share your thoughts with us?
Okay, thank you so much, Rob, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful panel. So I am Magdalena Wojciechak, a professor of communication here, and also, as Rob mentioned, associate researcher at the University of Amsterdam, where I direct a very large European grant. And first, let me give you a brief background on the current media environment to introduce my research. So as we all know, because we live in it, the current media environment offers unprecedented choice and nearly unlimited content. And I am very interested in the democratic implications of this brave new world and testing its effects on people's sociopolitical attitudes, cognitions, and behaviors. So why does it all matter? So first, I look how people choose information in this fragmented media environment. So given content multiplicity, people can easily avoid politics altogether. And this means that they will be less informed and less participatory. And all those are bad signs for a healthy democracy. And second, people who like politics and choose news instead of watching sports or fashion and so forth may only select news that is consistent with their prior views. And also on social media, as Jingwen introduced, interact mostly with people who confirm their biases toward political candidates or vaccines. And this is known as selectivity or echo chamber. Essentially, people select information that confirms their political preferences. And these echo chambers may fuel political polarization, as we are painfully seeing in the United States right now, making people more extreme and more hostile toward the other political side. So Democrats hating the Republicans and vice versa. And here you see, for instance, images of a burning refugee camp in Europe, the marches in Seattle, or the clashes related to the Black Lives Matter protests. So, all this is kind of assumed, right? People go online to confirm their prior biases, and that has tremendously bad effects. But, do people actually select like-minded news, right? Do they mostly communicate with like-minded partisans online? A recent work in political science, computer science, and communication uses behavioral data from users' internet browsing or Twitter activity to examine actual online behaviors, which is a wonderful advancement over experimental work in a lab or on or surveys, self-reports. So when it comes to news exposure, scholars actually find that most people in the US, but also elsewhere in the world, have very centrist media diets, mostly going to mainstream major media conglomerates. And also that in the US, Republicans and Democrats actually visit very similar websites online. So this is kind of, a little counter to this general knowledge, and I will talk more about that. And when it comes to information flow and exposure on social media, such as Twitter or Facebook, the evidence is mixed. So some studies, and I'm happy to talk about past work in detail later, find that people discuss politics on Twitter with like-minded others. So Republicans connect with Republicans, Democrats with Democrats, and that's how they discuss politics. And they also find that conservatives are more likely to do so than liberals. But other studies find that conservatives and liberals actually follow similar media accounts on Twitter. And that, in contrast, it's the conservatives who are more likely to follow liberal accounts. So engage in this kind of cross-cutting exposure and communication. And I will now present two projects. The first that extends the debate on echo chambers, because I argue that past work did not look at two key aspects of information sharing and exposure on social media. So the first is the sharing of content from political elites, such as the politicians or pundits or news media, who are, after all, as we know and research confirms, the most influential actors who also contribute the bulk of political content online. And second, the sharing is, of course, important, right? Because it shows what I see, what I endorse, and so forth. But we also have to account for whether users share the messages with positive or critical comments. So in the first project about to be submitted, we rely on a representative sample of almost 250,000 Twitter users and all the tweets that they shared over several years. And we rely on validated methods to assess the ideology of each user, whether conservative or liberal. And I'm happy to discuss details later. And we examine whether people are more likely to share messages from the political elites from their ideological in-group, right? So, for example, conservatives sharing tweets from President Trump or from Fox News, or from the opposing ideology. So, for instance, liberals sharing Trump's tweets. And basically, the information you share online, right, and this is why it's important, indicates what you endorse and what you decide to disseminate. But again, we also test whether people decide to add comments to the messages they share, the so-called retweets, and if yes, whether these comments are neutral, positive, or negative toward the message. So as the title of the paper suggests, presented on the previous slide, we find very robust pattern indicating clear echo chambers. So as you see in the figure here on the left, in-group messages are shared 14 times more frequently than out-group messages. And out-group sharing, so again, a liberal sharing conservative information, is extremely limited. It accounts for 7% of the tweets in our sample. And this sharing echo chamber, so to speak, is especially pronounced among conservative Twitter users. And again, as you see in the figure, they are over twice more likely than liberal users to share in-group versus out-group content. So the ratio of out-group to in-group shares is about 11:1. So the first panel here for liberals, and 21:1 for conservatives. So for each message from the out-group, they share 21 in-group messages. And these patterns are very robust. So they emerge for users who are very extreme and those less extreme, those who are politically interested and not so much, and across 21 different policies or political topics that we analyzed, whether immigration or transportation. And we also find that people are very unlikely to add comments to in-group tweets. So essentially, like I would just retweet the message without any comment from my ideological in-group. But they are frequently adding comments to out-group messages. And when they decide to do that, those comments, surprise, surprise, are very negative. So, for example, I see tweets from President Trump every day. Do I follow him on Twitter? No. Am I even allowed to vote in the United States? No. But I see those tweets because my liberal friends share them with their own, and again, always negative commentary that mocks the president. Right? So even if people engage with the out-group, which is very rare, they do so to mock the out-group. So again, this is the, and here also we find, as the figure here shows, that it's the conservative users that are most likely to do that. So the second project I will briefly mention, and I will bring it all together at the end, regards the effects of what people see and do online. Basically, we know that Americans are more polarized than ever, and many people and kind of pundits and the media actually blame like-minded exposure, so those echo chambers, and also partisan media for this polarization. And some experiments and surveys indeed find that exposure to partisan outlets and content is related to more extreme attitudes and greater out-party hostility. But needless to say, self-reports on surveys may not be reliable, and experimental designs tell us very little about polarization in the real world, right? Where people, again, have unlimited content to choose from. So it's really important to offer over time causal evidence on the effects of actual exposure to partisan media in so-called naturalistic settings where people can choose content on their own. So in this project, we recruited people online and paid them, of course, to take 2 surveys 3 months apart and to share with us the online browsing history that's stored on their computer. We used a very cool open source tool developed by my collaborator, web historian, which allows people, and here the screenshots show, to review their online browsing history, the search terms, the connections between what they do, and then to submit those data, this browsing history, with researchers. So in short, we tested actual exposure to numerous left, right, and centrist websites, and paired that actual exposure with people's reports of their attitudes on 5 different political issues, such as immigration or gender equality, and toward out-party supporters. So just very briefly, in the 2 minutes I have left, what do we find? You know, you can ignore the tables. We find almost nothing. So actual online exposure to partisan websites, liberal or conservative, did not exacerbate attitude polarization, so extremity. Do I support immigration more than I did before, or do I oppose it more than I did before? And neither in the aggregate nor among the Democrats or Republicans. There was only one exception, that liberal news made our participants slightly more negative toward out partisans, but this was the only effect. And we also find that exposure to like-minded, again, partisan sites has no effect whatsoever on polarization, despite the fact, again, as we believe, watching Fox would make conservatives more conservative, or watching MSNBC would make liberals more liberal. And also partisan news have no effects among the strongest partisans, who theoretically should be most likely to polarize. So why these effects that go really counter to this general knowledge? Well, it's because most people don't care about politics. And most people don't read news online or offline, for that matter. So in our data, during 6 months worth of browsing history, visits to news websites comprised only 2% of online browsing in the sample, 2%. And partisan news are even smaller drop in this ocean of online content. So yes, Fox News has about 2.5 million viewers, but Sunday Night Football has almost 10 times more. So, you know, why would partisan news have effect if so few people are actually exposed? So in sum, echo chambers do exist, but again, to put them in perspective, you know, the findings from the first study, only 22% of US population uses Twitter. 10% of users tweets about 80% of content, and most of the content is not about politics anyway. So the echo chamber I found in study 1 pertains to a very small fraction of the population. And again, partisan media, you know, they may well have polarizing effects, but we find that visits to these websites are so infrequent that the actual effects are very limited. And this is not to say that partisan news are not problematic. They may promote misinformation, generate anger, or normalize instability, but we find that they don't polarize attitudes. So this is all for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I have to say I'm shocked at what I just heard, but it's kind of good news maybe. So at this point, if you would maybe use the speaker view, because we're not gonna be using slides anymore. And what I'd like to ask the 3 panelists to do is to think of some things that they heard in the other presentations. We heard one presentation very much about face-to-face or auditory communication, the other 2 much more around social media. But I'd be curious what you heard in the others that you found interesting, useful. I will say, as you're thinking of your response for a minute, you know, this International Education Week really is about promoting global Aggies here at UC Davis. And what we mean primarily about that is facing global challenges, how we interact in this, especially in the age of COVID online, and how we can make that more effective. The measles epidemics, which have happened across our country, and misinformation, and then everything that's going on even today in our world around polarization. These are global challenges that are happening right now, and we're dealing with them right here on our campus. And our international scholars are bringing a wealth of amazing perspectives to help us understand what's going on around us. So I'm not going to pick any of you out, but before we go to questions from the other participants, what would the three of you offer as some learnings that you have, or some things that struck you in the other presentations? Who would like to go first?
I can go first.
Dr. Zhang, go ahead.
And as you heard, like my research and Magdalena's research were kind of similar. We're looking at same type of phenomenon, but really looking at very two specific topics. Mine is more focused on health, and her research is more on political attitudes and behaviors. I think in general, what I want to reflect is that, so currently what our research is really about focusing on understanding content, and also how people are interacting with content on social media, not really so much about conversations per se, right? So where Dr. Wang's research was really about trying to facilitate effective and meaningful conversations, which I really see could be a potential way out for addressing some of the misinformation sharing and exposure effects, right? So let's see, I could study how misinformation is impacting individuals' attitudes, but also I want to also study how people can have meaningful conversations with people from the other aisles or the opposite position. So in my context, it could be the anti-vaccine people talking with pro-vaccine people. Of course, people will have conflicts and a very negative emotionality towards each other, but how do we actually facilitate that kind of constructive conversations? That's a very important question to think forward. And especially for social media, we don't think that's a good platform for facilitating cross-group conversations, and Magdalena's work on incivility will tell you that it's oftentimes will end up with people just using a lot of incivil words toward the out group. So this is the question that I think we could actually, our research could come together and then try to think of innovative interventions to kind of finding the ways for the society to become more constructive and with regard to conversations that we would have for addressing global challenges like the current COVID situation. Yeah.
Great. And if I understood Dr. Wang correctly, we wouldn't even have to bring these opposing views into the same room. We could learn from each other, possibly at distance, by giving people the opportunity to engage more effectively. Dr. Wojciechak, you had your hand up. You wanted to say something. Thank you, Dr. Zhang. What kind of insight did you gain, or did you want to share with others?
So yes, as Jingwen now mentioned, our work partly overlaps and informs each other. And in fact, we do collaborate partly because I see misinformation in general and vaccine misinformation in particular as a sociopolitical problem, right? So I'm not only interested in elections, actually much less so than in attitudes toward different people and those sociopolitical issues such as vaccination, gender equality, immigration, and so forth. And kind of I want to counter what I said during my talk, partly because when we focus on kind of more strictly political communication on social media and find that it's very, very few individuals who are exposed to like-minded information or communicating those online echo chambers, maybe it's kind of insignificant in terms of the numbers, but as Jingwen mentioned during her talk, it has tremendous effects on the health of our society. Because it can be that very few people endorse misinformation about vaccines online, but if those few people refuse to vaccinate their children, the effects are very large. So that's what I wanted to mention, that even small numbers matter, right? They can tilt election and they can jeopardize public health. And with regard to Dr. Wang's super interesting work, I would really want to see that work and these effects tested with sociopolitical topics, right? Like, are people more understanding, depending on the modality or other cues, when they discuss, vaccination, when they discuss the presidency and the election? And I have done some work on that in the past without testing modalities, but I have done done work on online discussion and online deliberation, and found that it doesn't work at all. And so people do become more polarized. I've done work on face-to-face deliberation. It was in the context of gay rights in Poland, and again, it was deliberation with instructions, reminding people to be open-minded, reminding people to be civil, and so forth. Nothing. People polarized, right? So it's wonderful. Your results are great and super interesting. I just wonder how we can translate them, if at all, to sociopolitical context, which is the most kind of salient and the most important one, I believe, because it's easy to promote effective discussions about whatever, but can we do that, right, to increase understanding of people who are negative toward one another?
Great, thank you for that reflection. And Dr. Wang,
Yes.
what would you add based on what you heard? Your presentation was in a different domain than the other two, so I'm curious what your reflections are.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So really interesting presentation. I learned a lot about health information and socio-political, kind of a context. So my feeling is like, I started as a computer scientist. I still remember all things I learned was about algorithms, it was about software, hardware. And one day I realized that there's a community in computer science where we sort of study something interdisciplinary. We care about the sort of the kind of how people use technologies, right? And then I just jump into that. So I always told my colleagues in computer science, say, well, let's think about the context, right? Let's don't be so naive, right? Let's think about one technology can solve all the problem, right? That's not going to happen. But then, until today, like I listened to the presentations by the two communication faculty, I realized I'm still very naive, right? I'm still very naive about what I know, saying how people actually use information in the real world. I'm optimistic about saying, don't think about modality. I'm optimistic about thinking about interaction design, right? Think about what kind of interaction and behaviors you want people actually have, when they are interacting, right? And so design those features for those. But just as the comments I just heard, it's very difficult to trigger some desirable behaviors, like making people think, having a broader perspective, right? And take other people's angle, right? Don't be so narrow. It's very difficult to do that, maybe just based on single interactions. So I learned a lot about the context, and I'm really surprised at how stubborn people are, say, with their stance, right? Either with the health information or with their political stance, right? I think in the future, so roughly division is like I'm focusing a lot more on microscopic interactions between people and thinking about these kind of tiny features that we can tweak. And I see the broader, kind of larger, kind of societal context from the other presentation. I feel that in the future, because these things are kind of converge, right? Think about like social media, essentially having a lot of interpersonal features, small features, like when you like, and you have so many options today. But then these are design decisions, right? You can have sums, you can have smileys, right? But these are design decisions to make. I feel we probably want to know this kind of, and that's my reflection as an interaction designer. We want to know sort of how microscopic decision that we make affect the kind of bigger kind of interaction at a bigger level, community level, and come to a kind of unified understanding. So we sort of determine that maybe not the single best feature to use, but some kind of recommendation. What is the best practice, for the society, for the community to use these tools, right? And just like sometimes we have to tell kids, don't stay with your computer, go out, play with your friends, right? Computer is not doing anything good with you, right? Sometimes we have to tell them this, right? Just my reflection. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to ask one follow-up question, but while I am, if you have a question, we have about 20 minutes that we can take questions from participants online. If you put them into the chat, I'll take as many as I can. I'm not going to promise that we'll get to all of them. But one thing that strikes me in each of the three responses or the presentations, you know, what about the role of a third party? What about the role of not a partisan or nonpartisan in the case of immunization, you know, pro or anti-vax, but a mediator, someone that can play that mediating role? I don't see that role being expressed, whether it's in a political environment, Dr. Wojciechak, or even in Dr. Wang, it's always between two people. Is there a role for an outside party to mediate? And I'm using that in the broadest sense. And how would you view that in any of your work? Could that change the dynamic by bringing in not necessarily neutral, but a third different voice? Curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I can offer a couple of thoughts, and I'm sure Jingwen has some as well. So, you know, in a sense, I believe that Jingwen and I and Dr. Wang less so, we study kind of the world as it is, right? And Dr. Wang kind of wants to improve what's happening in the actual online communication. And in the world as it is, we are not having those third-party moderators on Twitter, on you know, on Facebook. We do on many other important platforms and very popular ones such as Reddit. But their role is not really to facilitate conversations between different people, but you know, delete incivility, for example. So, but in a sense, kind of going to Dr. Wang's work, you know, we have to study how the world would look if we did have those interventions by a third-party moderator. And, you know, as I mentioned, I have studied those kinds of conversations across partisan and issue lines, both in face-to-face context and online. And there were unbiased, trained moderators who were, again, trying to bring people closer and minimize, you know, divisions and polarization from happening, and it didn't work. Right? Like it's and that's kind of a very negative, you know, and sad outcome. But you know, I've tested several different things across contexts, so attitudes toward immigrants, gay rights, the left, the right, and so forth, and found very little impact. But again, you know, more work needs to be done.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I don't know if there was any other response. We do have a question from Dr. Wang. Did you want to respond at all to that? I don't.
Quickly, you know, just you know, when you talk about moderator, I was kind of thinking, because kind of the metaphor or the conceptual model I was talking about is like there's agent and channel, and this is a very standard communication model. I would say the channel today are no longer just passive, right? The channel today does a lot of things, right? Think about the social media platform. They are sort of active, right? And they does claim some agency. And so they are moderating to some extent, right? The algorithm kicking in to decide what's going to be prioritized, right? Or what's the rank of this news and these items, right? So it's playing some role, yeah.
Well, I do have a question from one of the participants. Given the current political climate and election results and the effects it's having and the announcement of 2 possible vaccines, what trends are you seeing and challenges do you anticipate? And maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Zhang. I was thinking the same thing. I mean, anti-vaccine attitudes are out there. They're in these tight networks, and now we have this pandemic and now vaccines coming. What challenge do you anticipate?
Yeah, so actually since March or April, there's several national surveys on people's COVID vaccine attitudes. And I think back like a few months ago, the results shows like almost half of people would say they would not get the COVID vaccine because of the fears of safety, all of that. But the recent news, I also like listened to the NPR discussions about a lot of the messages. So most of the messages were really just focusing on the importance of the getting the vaccine, but also in several of the interviews, there were also concerns expressed about the safety of the vaccine. So just imagine that as an ordinary person tuning into those type of discussions, The discussions themselves featuring both the effectiveness and the concerns would actually create this type of uncertainty in the viewers' minds, right? So, but I totally understand the journalists want to be balanced on what things they report, but those type of framing in the journalistic report would definitely give people these thoughts in considering COVID vaccine. So that could be definitely a challenge that public health practitioners and also researchers have to be more proactive in delivering those reassurance in people to understand the science, have believed in the science, and also take actions. So when I presented about the prevalence of anti-vaccine misinformation on social media, I now want to point out that because those groups are more active on the social media sphere, it means that the voices are not like balanced in those type of discussion, because definitely there's a lack of very fierce effort from the public health community to actually be more proactive of delivering their own messages. So we want to have more, voices coming from universities, coming from the researchers to actually make their perspective very clearly out there in the social media discussions and also on the interviews. Especially the other thing I want to highlight is that because people now are so dragged and becoming really anxious about the long-term effects of COVID, and with the research of infections in multiple states. So that kind of problem to solve, I wish that could put people in a more favorable position with vaccines in anticipating that this type of vaccination coverage will actually bring the society much closer to not having these infections for a longer time. So definitely with the risk perception with COVID contraction, and also to what extent the vaccines could protect us would play a role in helping individuals to make the decision. But I think all of those discussions have to be clearly communicated and more effectively communicated to the public in different communication channels.
Thank you. I'm inviting people who are participating. There's still a good number of you here. If you have questions, put them into the chat. I don't know if either of you had any further comments on that point.
I actually had a follow-up to my question with that, Rob.
Oh, sure.
Considering that you were mentioning balance, which is good, we've seen kind of this, though, like you said, this political sphere right now is so decisive. We have we see like this split of people who only want to follow the scientists, trust the scientists, can weigh the risk with this. But then, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have individuals who are more willing to believe what a certain politician says is gold, to frame it nicely. So I'm wondering if we're seeing a political transition in how you think messages, do you think they might have to be adjusted and come from both parties to kind of get everybody on board? Or how do you think that should play itself out, considering communication?
Was that the question about vaccines or a general?
Yeah, about because you remember we saw during the debate, one side where they said I wouldn't take the vaccine unless the scientists say it. If the president says it, I don't trust him, and vice versa. We've seen the other side where it's well, if the current president says it's good, I'm all in. If he doesn't, I'm not. Those two. Yeah. That we're seeing extremes.
But maybe we could even extend that to masks, wearing of masks and other safety. So.
Exactly, yeah, and messaging, related around that, and even, closings and limiting things, and the messaging around that.
Absolutely. So it would be wonderful, Mary, as you mentioned, to have a neutral and widely trusted source talk about these issues, but based on extant research, public opinion, and others, and Jingwen's included, there is no such source. So, it's not only the president versus, Joe Biden, it's also news media organizations, right? Because of what has been happening since 2016, in the United States, many conservative Americans have lost trust not only in more liberal news media such as CNN or MSNBC, but in news media in general, right, that are fake news. So in a sense, whatever is disseminated in the news, like they will just reject, or not they, but many people will reject. Right, the same goes for educational institutions, right? Universities. We should be the experts, right? We are experts, but still there is a sizable proportion of the American public that doesn't trust us, right? And here we are social scientists, but let's talk about public health scholars, or those who are actually doing work on those issues. They are also widely distrusted by a large portion of the public. So I really do not know who that neutral source that appeals to both sides can be, and whether one is possible. Again, it remains to be seen, but right now, to my knowledge, in the United States, there is no such source. And even as we see, vaccination or wearing masks or leaving your home are, again, political issues.
Yeah, just to add to that, I totally agree with what Magdalena just said, and it's really this credibility crisis currently in the information environment. So we're definitely seeing that people just very openly say that they don't trust anything like coming from any type of source, depending where you are with regard to the different types of information. And yeah, there's no like a current like a very highly credible information source existent in the media environment. So I think that's very important thing that we have to watch out. Especially, I just recently see a lot of like pundits on social media calling people to retreat from all informational sources, including political parties, including media, including journalists, right? So some people say like, we're not going to watch TV anymore. We're not going to read newspapers anymore, nothing. So we're just living our own world within our own local circles. And then there's existing platforms, they're out there for people to do this. Like if you haven't used or heard about Parler, that's a recent information sharing site that people just go there and just create their own information bubbles that they believe whatever is shared there without cross-checking with other sources. That's a very alarming issue we have to pay attention to, and then try to think about first, what's the origin of this issue we're saying, and second, what could be the possible solutions or interventions that we could think of to address this issue, unless it gets really so dangerous in the end that people lose trust in everything and anything. That's something that I personally are really concerned about. And the other thing that, aside from just talking about credibility crisis in the information environment, I also want to highlight what individuals can do in this type of situation, right? So we as individuals, we participate in communication, we participate in information sharing on social media. If we see someone else sharing a misinformation, what do we do, right? So that's a very practical thinking we have to take on. If I see someone sharing clearly disinformation on social media, and I'm friend with that person, right? So on other aspects, do I have the courage to engage with that type of difficult conversations on social media? That's something that we face every minute nowadays. So personally, I just say that I'm a little bit coward of confronting that type of misinformation. But if no one is doing that, we're definitely doomed in this situation. So I just want to put it on the table to ask everyone to reflect on our own information behaviors. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question that came in for Dr. Wang. Can you tell us more about the effects of gestures on clearly understood communication? Is video chatting helping us, or are the visual gestures distracting us?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. It is our belief, I think the current study, so far is the best recommendation is that still, especially for work, for text-oriented communication, turn on your video. That would help. Okay, those nonverbal cues still matter a lot, for us to communicate a lot of non-semantic content, like affective, like affective grounding, like where we understand other people's emotional state is still very important for the communication to go on. Okay. And then regarding gesture, I think it's a little bit more complex, because gesture, there are all different kinds. There are semantic gesture where the gesture does mean something. Okay, so like you are saying something that is big, then you make the gesture say it's big, right? So it's kind of semantic, right? But there will be gesture that we're just kind of just doing, we call speech accompanying gesture. We don't know what exactly it is. And if you ask the researcher to try to analyze those gestures, it takes forever because we can't get reliability to encoding those gestures. Okay, so there are competing theories. Like some say that this kind of gesture is just to fostering self-cognitive functioning. Okay, like embodiment, you are using your body to help you think. And the others say that this is communicative. I'm doing this for others' benefit. Okay, so that person can understand me. And there's mixed result. I would say there's mixed result, but I think more and more evidence showing that a lot of self-functioning is like self-enhancement is existing. Okay, and that's what I found in our studies. Okay. But I think the best recommendation is still turn on the video as much as you can. It doesn't serve just for just semantic communication. It serves other functions as well. Okay, and then for gesture, there's still a lot of things to study. Okay, so I don't think we have conclusion for that yet. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. And we have I think we have time for one final question. So this is just for all the researchers. Have any of you looked at any additional overlaps with people's religious views or religion in general? Religion was at the center, they give the example, religion is at the center of the Hasidic community outbreak in New York. I think they're referring to COVID, and causes many political minded people to be one issue voters. So the particular role of religion in communication.
I will just very briefly mention that political scientists in the United States have been, in general, observing that people's social identities, such as their religion, their race, their sexual identity, their occupation, are more and more closely aligned with their political identity. And now that partisanship is the so-called, as they say, overarching mega identity. So just kind of, that's, I don't know about the role in the measles outbreak, but in general, again, religion and other social identities of individuals that used to be, independent are now much more strongly related with partisanship than they ever were before.
And actually the question was about measles, not COVID, although I think there have been some challenges with COVID as well. So measles in particular. Dr. Zhang, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in our study of looking at the core arguments associated with anti-vaccination, there is definitely this argumentation on religion and also alternative medicine as people use them to counter-argue vaccination benefits. So that definitely plays an important role in people's decision making. But as communication scholars, I think there are always possibilities to craft new messages and arguments to work with religious ideas in adopting new behaviors and signs. So what we observed mostly for the arguments is only like one type of framing of vaccinations and inflict with religion. But that's, if you think about the possibilities of reframing those issues, that is just one type of argument. Personally, I would think about there are other possible reframing of the issues of bringing religion into the discussion of, for example, supporting vaccination. I don't see a lot of work in that sphere. It's very difficult, but I just do hope there is this possibility of creating new possibilities for opening people's minds to bring these two seemingly conflict ideologies together. So in my previous work, we had some experiences of working with churches on delivering safer sex educations for adolescents. And in those type of interventions, our approach would be really work with closely of the church members and pastors and also their educators to bring those type of new ideas and weaved with their base religious beliefs together to create those messages. So in that way, that's almost the only way that you could change people's beliefs and behaviors, because they now see this possibility of having these two different things coming together. And that's really about how you frame the issue and how you create those messages and argumentations. And I don't do that type of research much, but I also see some of churches adopting more positive attitudes toward LGBTQ populations. And there's a way that they frame that message to actually make people to be more acceptable to different positions that they used to have. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, I see we're at the bottom of the half hour, and we're going to bring this to a close. I appreciate Kim Hockey, staff member at SISS, for finding you and inviting you, because what you've given us, Dr. Zhang, Dr. Wang, and Dr. Wojciech, is really, really timely, things that we're experiencing every day in our lives. And so I want to thank Kim, and I want to thank each of you for taking this time out of your research to share with us these things. I think it's fascinating, things that I wasn't expecting to hear, and also some encouraging and maybe some challenges as well. So we appreciate you being here. We appreciate you being part of our time together. And we're going to go ahead and close this session with our words of thanks to you. So thanks.
Thank you.